I played 3 more mid-RPGs so you don't have to, because apparently, lightning really does strike twice. After my last round of digging through the backlog, I thought, hey, maybe I just picked the wrong games. Surely the next batch will be better. Spoiler, it wasn't. Once again, I dove into a handful of RPGs that seemed promising on paper. Interesting art styles, cool sounding gameplay hooks. Some even had glowing Steam reviews. But in practice, they ended up just being more aggressively average adventures. They weren't terrible, they weren't great, just mid. The kind of games that make you sigh when you realize you've sunk hours into them and can't remember a single character's name. So yeah, here we are again. Today we're looking at 3 more culprits of being mid. Greedfall, Age Veilgard, and the Outerworlds. Each one had big ambitions, each one had hype, and each one fell flat in the land of meh. This is a follow-up to my last video on the most aggressively average RPGs ever made, so if you like that one, you're in for part 2. And I'll be honest, these 3 might hurt even more, because every single one of them had the chance to be great. Instead, they settled for average. See, there's this game that wanted to replicate BioWare's formula, but in a colonial fantasy setting. That game was called Greedfall, and it might be the most aggressively average RPG of them all. On paper, you play as Desardet, a diplomat, warrior, and a trailblazer for your nation. You're sent to this newly discovered island to negotiate with rival powers, work with native tribes, and maybe even discover a cure for the plague ravaging your homeland. That pitch alone had people excited. It was unique, it was different, it was trying to be Dragon Age meets colonial politics. But the execution is where it all fell apart, because you don't actually feel like a diplomat. Every political conflict boils down to a fetch quest, or killing some big monster, and suddenly the problem is solved. You don't feel like a warrior either, because the combat is clunky and repetitive. You freeze an enemy, attack the enemy, repeat. And you don't feel like a trailblazer because the world is small, scripted, and endlessly brown. Exploration quickly turns into a slog. Every map looks the same with endless forests and rocky crags. Every city reuses the same assets right down to the identical governor mansions, and somehow every single person on the island speaks perfect English. The writing doesn't help either. It leans on the heavy-handed colonial tropes of noble savages, white savior arcs, and native accents so inconsistent you never know if you listen to a Scot, a Slav, or a Scandinavian. The game clearly wanted to explore serious themes, but it all comes across as tacky and shallow. And the story was predictable and pulpy. There's an anticlimactic villain reveal, a few weak twists, and a dialogue that ranges from serviceable to forgettable. It wants to be political intrigue, but it feels more like costume drama with some magic slapped on top. Now, some critics defend Greedfall as a solid AA RPG. They say, hey, it was made on a budget, cut it some slack. But here's the thing, plenty of indie RPGs made with smaller budgets deliver real depth, creativity, and fun. So Greedfall doesn't just get a pass for being aggressively average. And then there's Greedfall 2. When it was announced, fans hoped it might fix the first game's problems. Instead, early access had made things worse. Combat feels slower and worse, the presentation is weaker, and the story setup is even less inspiring. If Greedfall was a 5 to 7 out of 10, Greedfall 2 risks dropping into 3 to 5 range. Greedfall is the poster child for aggressively average RPGs, a brilliant pitch dragged down by shallow execution. Not bad enough to be infamous, and not good enough to be memorable. And if Greedfall is wasted ambition, then Age Veilgard is wasted budget. This was supposed to be the big return of the Dragon Age franchise, the most expensive game in the series, years of development, the full backing of EA. On paper, it should have been the triumphant comeback. Instead, it might be the weakest Dragon Age yet. The combat, first off, doesn't feel like Dragon Age. It feels like a generic hero action game, more like a Marvel game than a medieval fantasy world. It had flashy animations, sure, but it had no weight, no real tactics, and none of the complexity that really defined Origins. The writing was cringe, shallow, and often forced. Instead of deep characters and nuanced relationships, you get dialogue that feels written by a committee. This is especially noticeable in the infamous clip of Tosh literally putting down a bowl of vegetables and then saying, "So I'm non-binary."
Who the fuck starts a conversation like that? I just sat down.
But it's not just that one moment. Every interaction seems designed to push an agenda, instead of letting the world and its people feel alive. And that's not the worst of it. The RPG systems have been stripped to the bone. Where Origins gave you tactical pause, party synergy, and meaningful builds, Veilgard gives you a simplified, shallow system that plays itself. It looks modern, but it plays very generic. Think about that for a second. The game with the biggest budget in Dragon Age history is also the one that feels the most hollow. Compare that to Origins again. It wasn't perfect, the combat was slower, the graphics dated even for the time, but it had soul, every choice mattered, the writing carried weight, and the tactical gameplay followed a very strict identity in the CRPG genre. Veilgard has none of that. It's all style with no substance. And here's the scary part. When the most expensive entry in the franchise lands this flat, it doesn't just disappoint fans, it risks killing the series for good. Veilgard isn't just aggressively average, it's aggressively wasteful, and it leaves Dragon Age in the weakest position it's ever been. But at least Dragon Age had a strong legacy to lean on. Our next game, it didn't even really have that, because the Outer Worlds was basically promising New Vegas and space, and ended up being one of the most shockingly shallow RPGs in recent memory. The Outer Worlds was supposed to be special. It was Obsidian, the studio behind Fallout New Vegas. It was marketed as Fallout in space, and for fans burned out on Bethesda and desperate for a true RPG, it sounded like the perfect fix. But when it finally arrived, it wasn't great. It wasn't terrible. It was just aggressively average. And honestly, I'd even argue it was a little bit worse than that. Let's start with the opening. Fallout 3 gave you a small personal story. You grew up in the vault, built a relationship with your dad, and the world slowly expanded. You had time to care before the bigger plot kicked in. The Outer Worlds throws you into cryosleep, a random scientist wakes you up, dumps the main plot on you in 5 minutes, and sends you off on your way. There's no emotional hook, no reason to care, no reason to invest, and that lack of depth shows up everywhere else. Take the politics. The game was marketed as anti-corpo. Corporations as villains, a darkly funny take on capitalism. But instead of sharp, witty commentary, it's shallow parody. Corporations aren't evil for any real meaningful reason tied to ideology or economics. They're evil because they're evil. That's it. They just kill people and work their workers to death because they can. There's no depth, no critique, no bigger message like BioShock's take on objectivism. They're just cardboard villains in space. And the humor is extremely weak. It's not situational comedy, not clever satire, just wasn't that stupid moments over and over. There are a few good lines, sure, but it never delivers on the promise of a funny satirical RPG. And then there's the gameplay. Combat feels like Fallout Light. Slightly improved gunplay, but still clunky, still bullet spongy, and still again, very shallow. The exploration is empty. Bandit camps and monster dens with nothing interesting to discover, and leveling is boring. Perks are flat, the progression's unexciting, and even the science weapons wear out their welcome. Now, to be fair, it's not all bad. Some quests are well designed with multiple outcomes and clever choices. The dialogue system's very solid, giving you real options that reflect what you want to say, and there really aren't too many proper filler quests. And even visually, the environments are colorful and distinct. But that doesn't change the fact that this game had New Vegas in its DNA and still ended up being aggressively average. The Outer Worlds isn't unplayable by any means, but it's worse than that. It's forgettable. A game that had the perfect setup to be legendary, but instead settled for mid. And the Outer Worlds 2 has been announced, and it drops in 50 days or so. But unless Obsidian completely reinvents the formula, it's hard to imagine it being anything more than another 5 to 7 out of 10 game. And that's the thing. When you line it up next to Greedfall and Veilgard, you start to see the bigger picture. This isn't just about one disappointing RPG. It's a pattern. 3 RPGs with massive potential, 3 RPGs that had every chance to be great, and 3 RPGs that all ended up in the same place. Aggressively fucking average. It's not bad enough to be infamous, not good enough to be legendary, just stuck in the middle. And that might be the worst fate for an RPG, because at least bad games get remembered. At least disasters spark conversations. But aggressively average games, they fade into the background. They get forgotten. Greedfall was wasted ambition, Veilgard was wasted budget, and the Outer Worlds was wasted potential. Together, they remind us of the most painful truth in gaming. The opposite of greatness isn't failure, it's mediocrity. But now I want to hear from you. What RPGs do you think belong in the aggressively average Hall of Fame?